Imagine for a moment that everything you love disappears in a single day. Your family, your possessions, your health, your dignity. Everything vanishes like smoke in the desert wind. What would remain of your faith when the heavens turn to bronze and God keeps silent? This is the most unsettling story ever told, where a righteous man faced the darkest abyss of human suffering. In the land of Uz, under the relentless sun of the east, there lived a man whose name resonated like a hymn of holiness among all the tribes. Job was his name, and there was no other like him in all the earth. Perfect, upright, God-fearing, and one who turned away from evil. This is how the Most High himself described him. His life was the perfect image of divine blessing. 7 sons and 3 daughters formed his offspring. 7,000 sheep covered the fields like white clouds. 3,000 camels crossed the desert, carrying riches from city to city. 500 yoke of oxen plowed fields that produced abundant harvests. But Job's prosperity was not his greatest treasure. Every dawn, before the sun painted the mountains gold, he would rise to intercede for his children. He offered burnt offerings in case they had sinned in their hearts during the celebrations. This routine revealed something deeper than religiosity, a genuine communion with the Eternal One. Job didn't know that his name was being mentioned in the heavenly courts. He couldn't imagine that his integrity was about to be tested in a way that no human being had ever experienced before. The fiercest storm of his life was about to be unleashed, not to destroy him, but to reveal what his heart was made of. One day, something extraordinary happened in the heavens. The sons of God presented themselves before the throne of the Most High. Among them, like a sinister shadow, appeared Satan, the accuser, the adversary. His presence brought with it the smell of deceit and destruction. He had been prowling the earth like a roaring lion, seeking whom he could devour. The voice of the Almighty cut through the heavenly silence like thunder. "Where have you come from?" It was not a question born of ignorance, but an exposition of the restless nature of the enemy. Satan had been observing, calculating, planning. His response revealed his essence, from roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it. Then God spoke words that would change Job's destiny. "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil." It was the testimony of the Creator himself about his creature. Like a proud father showing off his son's achievements, the Lord presented Job as the perfect example of human integrity. But the accuser did not remain silent. With the cunning that has characterized him from the beginning, he launched an accusation that would cut to the very depths. "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has?" It was a cosmic wager about the very nature of human faith. The insinuation was devastating. Satan suggested that Job's faith was transactional, that his love for God had a price. "But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." The challenge was thrown down. The enemy wagered that Job's faith would crumble like a house of cards if he lost his blessings. And God accepted the challenge with precise limits. "Very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." The accuser left the divine presence with limited but terrible permission. He could touch Job's possessions, but not his life. The wager was not about Job alone. It was about all of humanity. Can anyone love God for who he is and not for what he can give them? Does disinterested faith exist? Is it possible to bless the name of the Lord both in abundance and in ashes? These questions resonated in the heavenly courts while the earth was about to witness a demonstration of faith that would transcend the centuries. It was a day like any other in Job's house. His children were celebrating according to their custom, enjoying the abundance that their father had worked to provide. Laughter filled the air, wine flowed freely. Job, faithful to his routine, was probably planning the sacrifices he would offer the next day. He had no idea that this would be the last day he would see his children alive. The first messenger came running, covered in dust and blood, his face disfigured by terror. The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby. The Sabaeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. The blow fell like lightning from a clear sky. 500 yoke of oxen and 500 donkeys had disappeared in minutes. The servants who were caring for them lay dead. Years of work evaporated like vapor, but this was only the beginning of a nightmare orchestrated from the shadows. The first messenger was still speaking when another appeared, staggering with scorched clothing. The fire of God fell from the sky and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. 7,000 sheep, the heart of his livestock wealth, had been destroyed by heavenly fire. The description was terrifying, the fire of God. It seemed as if heaven itself had turned against Job. The speed of the attack suggested supernatural coordination, as if invisible forces had orchestrated the simultaneous destruction from different directions. The accuser's hand moved with diabolical precision. He had not finished speaking when a third messenger arrived, panting, with bleeding wounds. The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. 3,000 camels, fundamental for desert trade, had been stolen. 3 consecutive blows had destroyed the prosperity of a lifetime. But Satan had saved the worst for last, knowing that a father's heart can bear the loss of riches, but breaks at the death of his children. The fourth messenger would bring the news that would make all the previous ones seem insignificant. While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came running, his face pale as death. Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. The silence that followed was more devastating than any storm. 10 children, 10 lives, all his future, his legacy, his descendants, buried under the rubble in an instant. The supernatural wind, the impossible tempest, had fulfilled the accuser's final purpose. It was an emotional bombardment calculated to destroy any vestige of faith. Each messenger ended with the same words, I am the only one who has escaped to tell you, as if they had been preserved specifically to bring pain to Job. There was no time to recover from one tragedy before the next arrived. It was a strategy from hell. First the oxen, then the sheep, then the camels, finally the children. Job found himself transformed in minutes from prosperous patriarch to completely ruined man. The riches accumulated over decades had vanished. The children raised with love lay dead. The servants who depended on him had perished. Everything he had built, everything he loved, had turned to ash and dust. Then Job stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate, like those of a man walking in a dream. He tore his robe as a sign of the deepest mourning. He shaved his head according to the custom of the afflicted. And then he did something that left heaven and hell speechless. He fell to the ground and worshipped. In the moment of greatest loss of his life, when all human reasoning screamed that he should curse heaven, Job worshipped the God who had allowed all this to happen. His lips uttered words that would echo through the centuries as a cry of unshakable faith. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. The declaration cut like a double-edged sword. Job recognized that everything he had possessed was a gift from God, and that God had sovereign right to withdraw it. May the name of the Lord be praised. Not even in total loss could this man stop blessing the name of the Most High. The sacred text records a crucial statement. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Despite the magnitude of the tragedy, despite the indescribable pain, Job did not sin against God with his lips or in his heart. The first round of the test had ended in victory for faith. Satan had failed utterly. Job had demonstrated that it was possible to love God unconditionally, that true faith did not depend on circumstances. He had blessed the name of the Lord both in abundance and in total loss. But the accuser, defeated but not surrendered, had another more sinister plan. Another day, the sons of God presented themselves again before the heavenly throne. Among them, Satan returned with his tail between his legs, but not defeated. His first strategy had failed, but he had one more card to play. The battle was far from over. The voice of the Almighty broke the silence again. Where have you come from? The same question, but now with a different background. Satan had been observing Job, studying his reaction, looking for some crack in his spiritual armor. His response was identical. From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it, God repeated his testimony about Job, but this time with a triumphant addition that must have burned the accuser's ears. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason. He still maintains his integrity. Those words rang like victory bells in heaven. Despite having lost everything, Job remained blameless. The first test had demonstrated that his faith did not depend on his possessions. The accuser had been publicly humiliated in the heavenly courts. But Satan launched a second accusation, even more cynical than the first. Skin for skin, a man will give all he has for his own life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. It was a proverb that meant people would sacrifice anything to save their own lives. The new wager was chilling. According to the enemy, Job had endured the loss of his goods because his own life had not been threatened. The survival instinct, the accuser argued, was stronger than any faith. If Job suffered in his own body, if he experienced constant physical pain, if his life hung by a thread, then surely he would curse God. God accepted the challenge again with the same unwavering limit. Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life. The accuser could attack Job's body, could inflict any physical pain, but could not kill him. Job's life had to be preserved for the test to be complete. Satan went out from the presence of God and immediately afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. It was not a common disease, but a supernatural affliction designed to cause the greatest possible suffering without causing death. It was physical torture in its purest form. The disease covered his entire body without leaving a single spot without sores. Painful ulcers erupted all over his skin. Unbearable itching tormented him day and night. Fever consumed his body. Nightmares assaulted his sleep. His breath became foul. His weight plummeted. His face became disfigured to the point of being unrecognizable. Job took a piece of broken pottery to scrape himself and sat down among the ashes. The image is heartbreaking beyond words. The man who had been the most respected in the East now sat in the city garbage dump. He used a piece of broken ceramic to scratch his open sores. The ashes where he sat were the place where garbage was burned and where the afflicted went to lament. He had become a spectacle, an object of horror to all who knew him. Those who had previously respected him now crossed to the other side of the road to avoid him. The children who had once greeted him with reverence now threw stones at him from a distance. He was the walking dead, a living testimony to human suffering. Then came the blow that no external enemy could have given. His own wife, seeing his desperate condition, broken by the pain of losing her 10 children and seeing her husband reduced to human wreckage, said to him, Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. We cannot judge her harshly. She too had lost her 10 children. She too had seen her economic security disappear. Now she saw the strong man in whom she had trusted reduced to a skeleton covered with sores. Her advice had a desperate logic. If Job cursed God, God would kill him, ending his suffering. Job's response was firm but not cruel. You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? His argument was logical and profound. If we accept God's blessings when they come, shouldn't we also accept trials when they arrive? Again, the text emphasizes Job's victory. In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. He had passed the second test. His faith did not depend on his physical well-being. Neither the total loss of goods nor extreme physical pain could break his integrity. Satan had failed for the second time, but Job was human, and the weight of so much suffering was beginning to take effect. Although he did not curse God, he would soon begin to ask very difficult questions. The drama was far from over. The battle would now come not from the external accuser, but from his own soul, tortured by divine silence. The news of Job's tragedy spread like fire throughout the East. 3 of his closest friends, men of position and respect in their respective regions, decided to make a journey to console him. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite agreed to come together. Their intentions were noble, their hearts were in the right place, but what they would do next would demonstrate a painful truth. Sometimes well-intentioned friends can cause more harm than declared enemies. Sometimes theology without compassion becomes the worst kind of violence against a suffering soul. Religion without mercy can be crueler than any persecution. When they arrived and looked up from a distance, they did not recognize him. The man who had been the very image of prosperity and dignity was now unrecognizable. The disease had disfigured his face so completely that his closest friends could not identify him. The transformation was total, devastating, impossible to process. Their reaction was immediate and visceral. They wept aloud. These were not silent tears, but deep weeping that sprang from the shock of seeing their friend in such a condition. They tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven, traditional gestures of extreme mourning. Their grief was genuine, their compassion real. Thus they sat down with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, because they saw that his grief was very great. This is one of the most powerful images in the book. 4 men sitting in total silence for an entire week. For 7 days and 7 nights, they were simply present. They did not try to explain. They did not offer premature advice. They did not minimize the pain. They recognized that there were situations where words are inadequate, where silent presence is the greatest gift that can be offered. This was paradoxically their moment of greatest wisdom. If the story had ended there, they would be remembered as the best comforters in history. But unfortunately, the silence was broken. After 7 days, Job opened his mouth, not to curse God as Satan expected, but to curse the day of his birth. In a torrent of painful poetry, he expressed his desire to have never existed. His words were the cry of a soul in total agony. May the day of my birth perish, and the night that said, a boy is conceived. Job did not directly question God, but he questioned the value of existence itself. He wished that the day of his birth would be erased from the calendar, that he had never been part of creation. He described death as a desired rest, a relief from the torture of living. Why is light given to those in misery and life to the bitter of soul? It was the question of a man who did not understand why life continued when everything worth living for had disappeared. Why did the sun keep rising? Why did the heart keep beating? Why did breath keep entering and leaving his lungs? It was then that Eliphaz, apparently the eldest and most respected of the group, decided that the silence had lasted long enough. His response would initiate a series of speeches that would reveal flawed theology and superficial understanding of suffering. Comfort was about to turn into accusation. If someone ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? But who can keep from speaking? Eliphaz began with an apology, acknowledging that his words might be troublesome. Unknowingly, he was prophesying exactly what would happen. His words would not only be troublesome, they would be like salt in open wounds. His argument was apparently logical, but fundamentally flawed. Who, being innocent, has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed, those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it. Eliphaz was applying the theology of retribution. The good are blessed, the wicked suffer. Therefore, if Job was suffering, there must be some hidden sin. Bildad followed with a similar but more direct and cruel argument. If your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin. With an insensitivity that cut like a knife, he suggested that Job's 10 children had died because they had sinned. The pain of this accusation must have been almost unbearable for a grieving father. Zophar was even more brutal in his judgment. Oh, how I wish that God would speak, that he would open his lips against you and disclose to you the secrets of wisdom. For true wisdom has two sides. Know this, God has even forgotten some of your sin. According to Zophar, Job wasn't even receiving all the punishment he deserved. These three men, with the best intentions, became what Job would call miserable comforters. They represented a theology that could not deal with the mystery of inexplicable suffering. For them, all pain had to have a direct moral explanation. Sin always led to suffering. Suffering always indicated sin. It was a simple, orderly equation, but completely false. Job responded with growing frustration. I have heard many things like these. You are miserable comforters, all of you. He accused them of twisting the truth, of being like torrents that fail when most needed. These men who had come to bring comfort had now become accusers more cruel than any enemy. Their theology had blinded them to compassion. The fundamental problem with Job's friends was that they were more interested in defending their theology than in understanding their friend. They had prefabricated answers to questions they had never personally experienced. Their error was not malicious, but it was devastating. Instead of sitting with Job in the mystery of his pain, they tried to resolve it with simplistic religious formulas. Instead of offering compassionate presence, they offered judgment disguised as wisdom. They accused an innocent man of imaginary sins to protect their orderly understanding of the universe. They could not accept that the righteous suffer, that pain does not always have a simple moral explanation, that God allows mysteries that defy our theological categories. The lesson is clear and painful. Sometimes the best comfort is compassionate silence, and theological explanations can be the worst kind of violence against a suffering soul. The first 7 days of silence were the true ministry of these men. Everything they said afterward only added weight to Job's burden. After enduring the incessant sermons of his friends, after being accused of sins he had not committed, after his pain was minimized and his integrity questioned, Job reached a breaking point. He could no longer maintain diplomatic composure. His soul cried out to be heard. His pain demanded expression. Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead or engraved in rock forever. Job had a prophetic intuition that his words had eternal importance, that his experience was not just personal, but universal for all who suffer without explanation. Unknowingly, he was asking for exactly what God would do, preserve his words for all future generations. His cry of pain would become one of the most studied and comforting texts in all of human literature. Billions of people through the centuries would find in his words the echo of their own suffering. Job began to address God directly, no longer through mediators, no longer with the diplomatic courtesy he had used with his friends. It was time for brutal honesty, for the naked soul before its creator. If God was listening, he needed to hear the unfiltered truth from a broken heart. Why do you hide your face and consider me your enemy? This question penetrates to the heart of human suffering. Job felt abandoned by the very God he had faithfully served all his life. It was not just the physical pain that tormented him, but the divine silence. God seemed to have hidden himself, treating his faithful servant as if he were his enemy. The arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks in their poison. God's terrors are marshaled against me. Job felt that God himself had taken him as a target. It was not natural forces or random circumstances attacking him, but the Almighty himself. This perception filled him with existential terror. If God was his enemy, who could help him? But then, in the midst of his deepest pain, Job proclaimed one of the most beautiful declarations of faith in the entire Bible. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. In the midst of total darkness, Job had a vision of the future. He saw beyond his present suffering, beyond his physical death, toward a future vindication. He knew there was someone who would defend him, that his case was not eternally lost. This hope was not vague or general, but intensely personal. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me. Job knew that he himself, with his own eyes, would see his Redeemer. This faith in the midst of despair is what makes Job one of the most extraordinary men in sacred history. The tension between hope and despair continued to tear his soul apart. In one moment, he declared faith in his future vindication. The next, he cried out for death as the only relief. Why did you not hide me in the grave and conceal me till your anger had passed? He wished he could hide until the storm passed. His questions became increasingly bold. Are not my few days almost over? Turn away from me so I can have a moment's joy before I go to the place of no return, to the land of gloom and utter darkness. Job was asking God to leave him alone, to stop the attack, to at least give him a small respite before dying. It was a desperate petition from someone who had reached the absolute limit of his endurance. Even the strongest man has a breaking point, and Job was there. But what is notable is that even at this point he never sinned against God. He did not blaspheme, he did not renounce his faith, he did not curse the name of the Most High. Job maintained his integrity without sacrificing his emotional honesty. His questions were not blasphemies, they were the genuine cry of a human heart seeking meaning in the midst of chaos. His questioning did not deny the existence or goodness of God, but desperately sought to understand his incomprehensible ways. He became the voice of all who have suffered without explanation, of all who have cried out to heaven without receiving an immediate answer, of all who have struggled to maintain faith when everything seemed to indicate that God had abandoned them. His brutal honesty before God would become a model for all believers in crisis. Job demonstrated that it is possible to be faithful and honest at the same time, that God prefers our authentic cries to our fake religious smiles. We don't need to pretend that everything is fine when our world is falling apart. God can handle our questions, our doubts, our pain expressed without filters. After 37 chapters of debate, after Job had exhausted his questions and his friends had spent all their arguments, after a young man named Elihu had given his own speech trying to defend God, something extraordinary happened. The heavens were torn open, the atmosphere charged with supernatural power. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm, not from a gentle breeze, not from a small, delicate voice, but from a whirlwind that shook the earth and filled the air with majesty and power. God's arrival was not quiet or gentle. It was a manifestation that made immediately clear who was speaking. The whirlwind enveloped the place where Job sat. From the midst of that supernatural storm, the voice of the Creator of the universe began to speak. The silence that had tortured Job for so long was finally broken, but not with explanations. but with questions that would reveal his total ignorance about the most basic matters of the universe. Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? God's first question was direct and penetrating. It was not a question born of ignorance, but rhetorical, putting everything in perspective. Job had spoken much about God's ways, but according to the Most High, he had obscured understanding with words that lacked true wisdom. Brace yourself like a man, I will question you, and you shall answer me. God invited Job to prepare for an exchange, but it would not be Job asking the questions. It was time for the Creator to examine the creature. It was time for the potter to interrogate the clay about his designs. And then began a series of questions that would humble all human arrogance and reveal the vastness of man's ignorance before divine wisdom. Each question was like thunder, shaking the foundations of human understanding. Each interrogation exposed the smallness of the creature before the greatness of the Creator. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. The first question was about origins. Job had not been present when God placed the foundations of the world. He had not been consulted, had not contributed, had not even been a witness. His perspective was limited by his temporal and finite experience. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? God described creation as a gigantic construction project, where each measure had been calculated with divine precision. On what were its footings set, or who laid its cornerstone, while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? The image is glorious. The creation of the world was an event that made the stars sing and the angels shout with joy. Job had not been there, had not participated in that cosmic celebration. His vision of the universe was like that of an ant trying to understand an architect's blueprints. Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? God spoke of his control over the most powerful forces of nature. The ocean, which for humans represents uncontainable power, for God was like a baby being set limits. When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness, when I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place, when I said, "This far you may come and no farther, here is where your proud waves halt." The sea, symbol of chaos and destruction, obeyed divine orders. It had limits it could not cross. The same power that controlled the oceans was in charge of Job's life. Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place? God asked if Job had ever had control over the most basic phenomena of daily life. Had he ever ordered the sun to rise? Had he directed the stars in their orbits? Had he controlled the seasons of the year? The questions continued like an unstoppable cascade. Each one revealed areas of creation where human wisdom and power were totally inadequate. Light, the depths of the sea, the gates of death, the vastness of the universe, meteorological phenomena, all were under divine control, but beyond human understanding. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or seen the storehouses of the hail, which I reserve for times of trouble, for days of war and battle? Even the phenomena that Job could observe, like snow and hail, had purposes and systems he did not understand. What is the way to the place where the lightning is dispersed, or the place where the east winds are scattered over the earth? The most fundamental forces of nature operated according to laws that Job had not established and could not control. Who cuts a channel for the torrents of rain and a path for the thunderstorm to water a land where no one lives, an uninhabited desert? God revealed that his care extended beyond human needs. He made it rain on deserts where there were no people, demonstrating that the universe did not revolve around human beings. There were divine purposes that completely transcended humanity's interests. The cosmos was larger, more complex, more mysterious than any human mind could comprehend. After humbling Job with questions about inanimate creation, God directed his attention to the animal kingdom, but he did not speak of common creatures. Instead, he presented two beasts so extraordinary, so powerful, so impossible to domesticate by human hands that they defied all understanding. They were symbols of divine creative power that was completely beyond human control. Look at Behemoth, which I made along with you and which feeds on grass like an ox. God presented the first creature with a surprising statement, which I made along with you. Behemoth was the work of the same hands that had formed Job, but was completely different in nature and purpose. It was a creature of colossal dimensions. What strength it has in its loins, what power in the muscles of its belly. Its tail sways like a cedar, the sinews of its thighs are close-knit. This was not a description of any known animal. A tail that swayed like a cedar suggested something of unimaginable size. Its bones are tubes of bronze, its limbs like rods of iron. Behemoth was not just large, but practically indestructible. Its bone structure was like metal, its limbs like forged iron bars. It ranks first among the works of God, yet its maker can approach it with his sword. This statement is crucial. Behemoth ranked first among the works of God, a masterpiece of divine creation. Only its creator could approach it with a sword. No human being had the power to tame or destroy this creature. It was a living testimony to creative power that is completely beyond human reach. Under the lotus plants it lies, hidden among the reeds in the marsh. The lotuses conceal it in their shadow. The poplars by the stream surround it. The creature was so large that entire mountains served as its pasture. A raging river does not alarm it. It is secure, though the Jordan should surge against its mouth. Then God presented a second, even more terrifying creature, Leviathan. Can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook or tie down its tongue with a rope? Can you put a cord through its nose or pierce its jaw with a hook? Will it keep begging you for mercy? Will it speak to you with gentle words? Will it make an agreement with you for you to take it as your slave for life? The questions were sarcastic. Human fishing methods were ridiculously inadequate for this beast. Leviathan could not be domesticated like a common animal. It would not beg for mercy. It could not be trained to serve. Can you make a pet of it like a bird, or put it on a leash for the young women in your house? Will traders barter for it? Will they divide it up among the merchants? The idea of Leviathan as a pet or as merchandise was absurd. Can you fill its hide with harpoons or its head with fishing spears? If you lay a hand on it, you will remember the struggle and never do it again. The warning was clear. Anyone who tried to fight Leviathan would regret it forever if they survived to tell about it. Any hope of subduing it is false. The mere sight of it is overpowering. Just seeing Leviathan was enough to make a person faint from terror. No one is fierce enough to rouse it. Who then is able to stand against me? And here came the central point. If no one was brave enough to awaken Leviathan, who could face the God who had created it? Flames stream from its mouth, sparks of fire shoot out, smoke pours from its nostrils as from a boiling pot over burning reeds. Its breath sets coals ablaze and flames dart from its mouth. Leviathan was a creature of fire, like a living dragon but real, not mythological. It was pure power, incarnate terror, indomitable majesty. Strength resides in its neck. Dismay goes before it. When it rises up, the mighty are terrified. They retreat before its thrashing. Nothing on earth is its equal, a creature without fear. It looks down on all that are haughty. It is king over all that are proud. Leviathan was unique on earth, without fear, despising everything humans considered great and powerful. It was the king of all proud creatures, a symbol of power that is completely beyond human control. The message was clear as crystal. If Job could not understand or control these creatures that God had made, how could he presume to understand or question the ways of the Creator himself? If the creatures were beyond his comprehension, how much more the Creator? If he could not handle the clay, how could he question the potter? After hearing the voice of the Almighty from the whirlwind, after being confronted with questions that revealed the vastness of his ignorance, after contemplating creatures whose power was completely beyond his understanding, Job found himself at a crucial moment of decision. Human pride melted like wax before the fire of the divine presence. It was not the time to defend his position. It was not the time to explain his suffering. It was not the opportunity to seek answers to his questions. It was the moment of total surrender before the God who had spoken from the storm. It was time for the clay to bow before the potter, for the creature to worship the Creator. Then Job replied to the Lord, "I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted." Job's first words were a confession of divine omnipotence. He was no longer the man questioning God's ways, but someone who fully recognized the absolute power of the Most High without reservations or conditions. "Who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge?" Job quoted the exact words God had used to confront him. "Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know." He acknowledged that he had spoken of matters that were beyond his understanding, that he had obscured divine understanding with his human ignorance. The phrase, "things too wonderful for me," reveals a complete transformation in Job's perspective. What he had previously seen as incomprehensible and unjust, he now recognized as wonderful, though beyond his capacity to understand. Mystery was no longer a threat, but an invitation to worship. "You said, 'Listen now, and I will speak. I will question you, and you shall answer me.'" These words repeated the invitation God had made to him, but now Job spoke them with a completely different attitude. It was no longer the challenge of someone demanding answers, but the humble plea of someone who recognized his need to be taught by the only wise one. And then came the most striking statement in the entire book, the words that summarized Job's entire experience. "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." This simple sentence contains the key to the entire transformation. Throughout his life, he had known God second-hand, through traditions, teachings, others' experiences. He had faith in a God he knew by reference, but now, in the midst of the deepest suffering of his life, he had a direct encounter with the Almighty. His eyes had seen what he had only heard before. The difference between intellectual knowledge and personal experience had become dramatically and unforgettably clear. "Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." The word despise here does not mean that Job hated himself. In the Hebrew context, it meant that he despised himself in comparison to the divine glory he had beheld. His repentance was not for specific sins, but for the attitude of questioning God from his limited perspective. He repented of having spoken as if he were equal to God, as if he had the right to demand explanations from the Creator of the universe. The dust and ashes was not just an expression of humility, it was the recognition of his mortal nature before the eternal God. He saw himself as what he really was, a creature made from dust, dependent on divine breath. This moment of surrender was not a humiliating defeat, but a glorious liberation. Job had finally found what he had been seeking throughout his suffering. Not answers to his questions, but the presence of the God who was beyond all questions. The presence was enough, more than enough, abundantly enough. The irony is beautiful. Job had demanded an encounter with God to defend his case, to prove his innocence, to obtain justification. But when he finally saw God, he no longer needed to defend himself. The divine presence was all he needed. There was no explanation of why he suffered. There was no revelation of the cosmic wager between God and Satan. There were no elaborate theological answers. There was only the overwhelming presence of the Almighty, and that was infinitely more than enough. In this encounter, Job learned that true faith does not consist in understanding God's ways, but in trusting God's character. It is not about having all the answers, but about personally knowing the God who has all the answers. Job's transformation was complete. The man who had begun perfect in his external integrity was now perfect also in his internal humility. He had gone from knowing about God to knowing God himself. This surrender was not the end of his story, but the true beginning of a new life, deeper, richer. And it came to pass that after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, "I am angry with you and your two friends, because you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has." God's first act after the encounter with Job was to address the three friends. His verdict was surprising and revealing. He was angry with them, not with Job. Throughout the entire debate, these men had believed they were defending God. They had argued for his justice, they had explained his ways, they had tried to justify his actions. But according to God himself, they had not spoken correctly about him. In contrast, Job, who had questioned and cried out, had spoken what was right. "So now take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. You have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has." God ordered a specific sacrifice and designated Job as intercessor. The man who had been accused by his friends now became their priest. The one who had been judged now had the privilege of praying for his judges. The irony was perfect. The men who had come to intercede for Job now needed Job to intercede for them. The comforters needed comfort. The teachers needed forgiveness. The judges needed mercy. So Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite did what the Lord told them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. The three friends obeyed humbly. They did not argue. They did not protest. They did not try to justify their words. They recognized their error and sought the intercession of the one they had wounded with their insensitive speeches. After Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. Job's restoration began at the exact moment when he prayed for his friends. Not when he humbled himself before God, not when he confessed his ignorance, but when he interceded for those who had deeply hurt him. This is a profound lesson about the nature of forgiveness and restoration. Sometimes our own healing is connected to our capacity to pray for those who have wounded us. Forgiveness liberates the forgiver as much as the forgiven. Intercession for our offenders opens doors that nothing else can open. All his brothers and sisters and everyone who had known him before came and ate with him in his house. They comforted and consoled him over all the trouble the Lord had brought on him, and each one gave him a piece of silver and a gold ring. Job's restoration was not only material, but also social. The people who had probably avoided him during his illness now returned to his life. They brought gifts, but more importantly, they brought their presence and their comfort. The community that had dispersed in the time of testing now gathered in the time of restoration. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. The material blessing was exactly double what he had before. Where before he had 7,000 sheep, now he had 14,000. His 3,000 camels became 6,000. Everything was restored in double abundance. And he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. The children were restored in the same number, not in double quantity. Some interpret this as evidence that Job would see his first 10 children again in the resurrection, thus completing the double restoration even in the area of his offspring. The first 10 were not lost, they were only waiting. The first daughter he named Jemimah, the second Keziah, and the third Keren-Happuch. The daughters' names are significant. Jemimah means dove, a symbol of peace. Keziah means cinnamon, suggesting sweetness and value. Keren Hapuch means horn of antimony, referring to a cosmetic that beautified the eyes, a symbol of restored beauty. Nowhere in all the land were there found women as beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father granted them an inheritance along with their brothers. This note about the beauty of his daughters and the fact that they received an inheritance, something unusual in that culture, suggests that Job's restoration brought with it a new perspective on human value and dignity. After this, Job lived 140 years. He saw his children and their children to the fourth generation. Job lived double the 70 years that were considered a complete life in those times. He had the privilege of seeing 4 generations of descendants, an extraordinary blessing in any age, a testimony to divine faithfulness. And so Job died, an old man and full of years. The final description is perfect in its simplicity. Job died old and full of years, a Hebrew expression indicating a complete and satisfying life. He did not die bitter from his suffering. He did not die resentful toward God, but full, complete, satisfied. The man who had lost everything now had everything again and much more. But the lessons of the book of Job transcend his personal story. His experience teaches us eternal truths about suffering, faith, and God's sovereignty that every believer should know. First, we learn that suffering is not always the result of sin. Sometimes the righteous suffer precisely because they are righteous. Their integrity can make them targets of special tests. Second, we discover that God does not owe us explanations. We have no right to demand that He justify His ways before us. Our responsibility is to trust His character, not understand His methods. The clay does not interrogate the potter about his designs. The creature does not demand explanations from the Creator. True faith trusts without fully understanding. Third, we learn that true faith does not depend on circumstances. Job could say, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him," because his faith was founded on who God was, not on what God did for him. This is the difference between genuine faith and transactional religiosity. True faith loves God for God Himself. Fourth, we see that God's presence is more valuable than His gifts. Job found complete satisfaction, not in the restoration of his goods, but in the personal encounter with his Creator. "My eyes have seen you" was more precious than 14,000 sheep. Relationship surpassed possessions. Communion transcended prosperity. Fifth, we learn that our knowledge of God can be tremendously superficial until we go through deep trials. Sometimes God allows suffering to take us from knowing about Him to knowing Him personally. The fire of suffering burns away superficial religiosity and reveals genuine faith. Pain can be the most direct path to the divine presence. Job's story does not answer all our questions about suffering, but it gives us something infinitely better. It shows us how to suffer with faith, how to maintain integrity in crisis, how to find God in the darkest places of human experience. His cry, "I know that my Redeemer lives," resonates through the centuries as a declaration of unshakable hope. And his final confession, "My eyes have seen you," reminds us that the ultimate goal of every trial is not explanation, but the revelation of the God who is beyond all explanation. We don't seek answers, we seek the God who is the answer. We don't demand understanding, we seek the God who understands all things perfectly. The secret of Job that every believer should know is not a magic formula to avoid suffering. It is not a technique to manipulate God. It is not a method to guarantee prosperity. The secret is this: in the midst of the deepest pain, when everything has been lost, when God seems to be silent, when friends become accusers, when the night is darkest, there, precisely there, God reveals Himself. He does not always explain suffering, but He reveals Himself in the midst of it. He does not always answer our questions, but He makes Himself personally known. and his presence, his voice from the whirlwind, his glory revealed in the midst of the ashes, is more than enough. It is everything. It is all we need. It is the treasure that makes all losses seem insignificant. Job teaches us that when heaven falls silent, it is because God wants to be heard in the silence. When God allows everything to fall apart, it is because he wants to build something new and deeper. When he takes us to the desert, it is because there, far from distractions, we can finally see him clearly. Suffering is not the end. It is the path toward an encounter that will transform everything. So, if you are in the midst of your own dark valley, if you have lost what you love most, if God seems to be silent, if your friends have abandoned you, or worse yet, have accused you, remember Job. Remember that the most righteous man of his generation went through the fire of the most intense suffering. Remember that he maintained his integrity without understanding. Remember that God eventually spoke, not with explanations, but with revelation. Remember that restoration came, but only after the encounter. Remember that "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you," was the victory cry of a man who had found the only thing that really matters, the presence of the living God in the midst of the ashes of his life. May your story, like Job's, end not only with material restoration, but with something infinitely more valuable, a personal, deep, and unshakable knowledge of the God who allows storms to reveal his glory in the midst of them. May you be able to say with Job, "I know that my Redeemer lives." And may that certainty be enough, no matter what storms may come.